This presentation looks at historical examples of eugenic practices in the United Kingdom and the United States. It uses feeble-mindedness as a case study. Feeble-mindedness is a historical term for people with recognised learning disorders. These days we would call them people with special educational needs. The history of eugenics is controversial, difficult, and emotional. At its heart, it asks the question whether some human life is more valuable than others. The question is, to whom is life more valuable? Is it the state, the nation, the race, future generations, parents, families, or communities? It is essentially a reductionist way of thinking, reducing people to categories with an empirical value, because they are either fit or unfit to live in society. Reginald Punnett was the world's first professor of genetics in the University of Cambridge. He was one of the people who pioneered the establishment of Mendel's thinking in science. Punnett was concerned with feeble-mindedness, by which he meant low educational attainment. He believed that this was caused by a single gene, which was recessive. Therefore, eliminating all people with feeble-mindedness would not eliminate the recessive allele from the population, because most of the alleles would be hidden in people who were heterozygous, with one copy of the feeble-mindedness allele hidden. And feeble-mindedness would reappear in each generation in a quarter of the children they produced. Therefore, he argued that if we wish to rid the world of feeble-mindedness, we will have to find some method other than simply eliminating the feeble-minded people themselves. From an ethical point of view, it is interesting that he was even prepared to consider eliminating feeble-minded people, which shows the power of reductionist thinking in action. In 1930, the statistician Ronald Fisher produced a very important book on natural selection, which changed how scientists think about Darwin's theory of evolution. 1/4 of that book was dedicated to Fisher's thinking about eugenics, and he used the 1911 census data to show that people in lower social classes had more children than those in more educated, wealthier, middle and upper classes. Thus, he argued, what was needed was some form of welfare payments to encourage the fitter members of society to produce more children. Fisher was a strong advocate of eugenics across Europe, and even refused to condemn the eugenics movement in Germany in the 1930s. There has been, in recent days, a revulsion against Fisher's contribution to eugenics. In June 2020, Fisher's Cambridge College, Keyes College, removed a 1989 stained glass window which commemorated Fisher's work, and his old workplace, the Rothamsted Research Station, was forced to issue a statement in June 2020 condemning Fisher's involvement with eugenics. Thus, Emerging from the work of a number of very eminent English geneticists is the idea that eugenics can act in a positive way. Positive doesn't mean good in this context. It means producing interventions that change behaviour. These positive interventions would encourage fit people to have more children through financial incentives. Unfit people would be educated about eugenics and would selflessly forego their right to have children in order to prevent the spread of their undesirable heredity. Negative eugenics works by preventing people doing what they want through marriage restriction, segregation, sexual sterilisation, and, in its most extreme form, euthanasia, killing affected people. The early geneticists were not stupid, but they did not share contemporary social values. They felt it was their responsibility as scientists to offer support to shaping society. However, they were not able to see beyond the limitations of their own genetic models. As Spencer and Paul argue, the rise and fall of eugenics is a lesson that most modern medical geneticists and indeed social scientists would do well to heed. In the United States in the 1900s, Charles Davenport and his colleague Henry Goddard were investigating feeble-mindedness with the assumption that it was controlled by a recessive allele of a single gene. Goddard visited France and brought back the newly developed Binet-Simon intelligence test and applied it to the residents of the Vineland, a training school for feeble-minded boys and girls in New Jersey. He found that although the ages of the residents of the school ranged up to 50 years of age, none of the residents had a mental age of greater than 12, according to the tests. In 1911, Goddard noted that the test results for a wide range of populations showed that there were variations in the degree of feeble-mindedness, and began to reclassify feeble-mindedness as shown in the table. Goddard's classification has now passed into common speech as familiar insults to a person's intelligence. This reflects the power of the labels that Goddard invented. In 1917, Goddard published a book called The Kalikak Family, a study in the heredity of feeble-mindedness, which examined a family apparently anonymized under a pseudonym from the Pine Barren region north of the Vinelands Training Centre. The study centred on the family of a resident of the Vineland Training School who was pseudonymously called Deborah Kalikak, although she was easily identified as Emma Wolverton, who died in 1978. The book was an instant bestseller and contained family pedigrees running back to one Martin Kalikak, Deborah's great-great-great-grandfather. The book asserted that Martin had 2 children, one with his wife, a morally upright woman, and the other with a feeble-minded barmaid. He abandoned the barmaid soon after she became pregnant. On the feeble-minded side of the Kalikak family, descended from the abandoned single-parent barmaid, the children wound up poor, mentally ill, delinquent, and intellectually disabled. Deborah was descended from the illegitimate offspring. On the normal side of the Kalikak family tree, the children Martin had with his wife and their descendants all ended up as prosperous, intelligent and morally upstanding. They were lawyers, ministers of the church and doctors. None were feeble-minded. Contemporary researchers such as Smith and Waymeyer and Stephen Jay Gould dispute the historical accuracy of this account. They claim that the whole thing was fabricated by Goddard and his co-workers. Nonetheless, the book was hugely influential in the development of eugenics in the popular imagination in the United States. The case has been discussed in detail by Carl Zimmer in his 2018 book, who paints a very human picture of the person behind the story. Driven by success and popular acclaim, Henry Goddard continued to apply his Binet-Simon test to wider groups of people, and in 1917 he reported that of 2 out of 5 of those who arrived as immigrants in New York were feeble-minded. This led to considerable interest in testing for differences between races, which continues today. Other researchers, Yerkes and Terman, carried out extensive testing on recruits in the United States Army. One striking conclusion was that the average white recruit, and therefore by implication the average white American, had the mental age of a 13-year-old. And although the average intelligence of black Americans was just as low as most white Americans, blacks accounted for a disproportionately large fraction of those classified as feeble-minded. The Army tests suggested that the average black person in the United States Army had a mental age of a 10-year-old. This case study of feeble-mindedness highlights differences in the eugenic approach of Britain and the United States before the Second World War. Whereas in Britain, eugenicists such as Fisher and Punnett were obsessed with social class, in the United States the emphasis became much more on racial differences. It could be argued that these differences persist today.